Dr. Price, the New Testament canonical texts excluded a lot of religious literature that was circulating in the Christian circles in the first few decades or centuries. Would Dr. Bob agree that the New Testament was designed to reinforce a proto-Orthodox, Orthodox understanding, in quotations, understanding of Christianity, and therefore to really understand that what the original generations of Christians believed their religion was about, we should pay very close attention to non-canonical documents that did not make it into Eusebius's edition of the New Testament canon?
I wouldn't necessarily say it's trying to propagate a misreading of early Christian doctrine, since it's not absolutely clear that there was a single version originally. But the point of this is good, because the point of having a canon at all is to restrict your options for revelation and teaching. Why did Saul ban the soothsayers and the spirit mediums and all that? Why did Isaiah condemn necromancy and astrology? Well, to limit your access to supposed revelation. What could you do? Well, you could you get the priest to use the Urim and Thummim, which were apparently kind of dice, two stones, black on one side, white on the other, and you'd ask yes or no questions and shake them up and toss them, and like if it was two whites that came up, yes. If it's two blacks, no. And if it's mixed, you try again. That's the best guess I've heard as to what they were. And there was also the priestly ephod, which was some kind of a breastplate with jewels, 12 of them, that it says stood for the 12 tribes of Israel, which may be true, but ultimately it's probably the 12 houses of the zodiac, and which might have denoted some sort of astrological divination, because that's the only reason anybody's interested in astrology, right? They want to try to find out what's going to happen to them. So those were legitimate, and they were under the control of the priesthood. So they're not gonna let you go hear stuff they don't want you to hear about how Baal is going to win a great victory. Oh, no. So that's what they were doing. That's one big reason the Catholic Church is very careful about endorsing Marian apparitions. Who knows what Mary is going to say to these illiterate kids on the hillside? So they're very, very careful about that. Same way, they wanted to make sure Christians reading the text were reading safe texts and wouldn't be like the Gospel of Peter. That was read in Syria, and this bishop was shown a copy, and he, because they said, well, what about this? Is it okay we read it on Good Friday or something? And he said, he read through it, and we have a fragment of it now, but not the whole thing. And he said, well, it looks okay to me. I don't mind if you use it. And then somebody came back to him and said, Bishop, I think you ought to take a closer look at this. And he said, yeah, it says that Jesus seemed to suffer. It sounds like docetism. Okay, don't read it. Well, that's a great laboratory specimen of the kind of thing that was going on. And because most of the rest of it wouldn't have been considered objectionable, even where it didn't fit with the other Gospels when it added material and such. The same thing was true with the various other Gospels and epistles and acts and treatises. If you didn't like Encretism, the celibacy gospel, you sure wouldn't want people reading the Acts of Paul, the Acts of Thomas, the Acts of John, and other ones, because all of them promoted Syncretism. You got to swear off sex to be saved. And since it's so ascetic, they all taught docetism, that Jesus did not have a genuine physical body. No, even though there are nice, edifying miracle stories in there, no, this stuff's off the chart. You can't read that. And in fact, they fired some clergyman who claimed to have written the Acts of Paul to honor him. And then there were these gospels that, like the Gospel of Truth by Valentinus, is sort of an essay on the Gnostic understanding of salvation. And they figured, nah, that's Valentinian heresy, forget that. And there was a Gospel of Basilides, which might have been the same as one of the Gospels according to the Egyptians. And it seemed to be heretical. Then there was the Gospel of Thomas, which was recovered in 1945. Some of that teaches like pre-existence of the soul and salvation by knowledge, but a lot of it, the weirdest sounding stuff in it is just using unfamiliar metaphors, and wouldn't really be objectionable if you did your homework. But it was the favorite of groups like the Naascenes and the Manichaeans and Valentinians. They said, no, guilt by association, we're not having that stuff in here. But this was like I think you can get an idea of the history of the canon through 3 episodes. Four, I guess. Marcion, who rejected the Old Testament as the Jewish scripture, which he didn't believe predicted Jesus, and had nothing to do with Jesus. The Creator God who gave the law is not the Father of Jesus. That's a different God altogether. So he doesn't seem to have been an anti-Semite or even an anti-Judaist theologically. He just said, this is not our religion. Let's not try to co-opt it from the Jews. But we need a religion. And how about the writings of the one apostle, Paul? The only one who understood Christ, because if you ever wondered why Jesus had the 12, and yet Paul is the guy he appears to separately and makes him the great apostle, the only one really know anything about? Well, it's because, as Mark's gospel says, the 12 were a bunch of dullards who didn't understand anything he said. They didn't understand the novelty of his teaching, that it wasn't part of Judaism. And so Marcion had a canon consisting, eventually the Marcionites had a canon of 10 Pauline epistles, not counting the pastorals, which were written subsequently to try to refute Marcion. And of course Hebrews, not written by Paul anyway. And there were earlier versions of the texts of those epistles. And they had a single gospel, and they didn't call it Luke, but it was an earlier version of what we call Luke. And so he had 2 books, the Apostolicon, the book of the apostle, and the Evangelion, the book of the gospel. And let's see, this went over like gangbusters. Marcionism succeeded fabulously all over the Mediterranean world and threatened the emerging Catholic Church. And Polycarp apparently decided, a very influential bishop, we could probably siphon off a whole lot of these heretics and get them to come to our church if we accepted Paul and accepted his writings and that gospel, but we're going to need to sanitize them. We don't want just one gospel. We want some more perspective. So what's that one? Matthew, Mark, John. Though you can see Marcionite elements even in there, but they added stuff strategically to calm it down. It looks like Polycarp may well have written the pastoral epistles, added material to Luke, and written at least half of the book of Acts, partly based on an Aramaic document that comprised the first 15 chapters, and then he freely wrote the last chapters. And he went around finding things that could pass for non-Pauline apostolic writings. James, Jude, Peter, John, and so forth. Even though it was pretty dubious who had written any of them, but at least that was the best he could scrape up to provide a counterweight to Paul. Acts, of course, says there are other apostles, even though Paul still steals the limelight. It was touch and go for centuries with Hebrews and Revelation, because for one reason, Hebrews is very rough on apostates, and this was a big deal in times of persecution. Bishops would chicken out and, okay, here's the scripture, you can use it as firewood, just let me go. And they said, okay. And then these jerks would come back later, hat in hand, and say, well, I was just kidding, can I have my office back? And they said, no, you're going to hell. This was a huge thing. And Hebrews says, if you turn your back on Christ, you're trying to crucify him all over again, and it ain't happening. So it's a terrible thing to fall into the hands of God, and so forth. And the book of Revelation, need I say more? One church father said it's disgusting and ridiculous. Martin Luther thought the same thing. I happen to love the book of Revelation. It is just a great work. But the East didn't like Revelation, the West didn't like Hebrews, and that's one reason Paul's name got attached to it, to make it, to slide it in. So Polycarp pretty much came up with the 27-book New Testament, though around the edges it's a little bit iffy. Now, he must have done this around 125 AD, fairly early in the 2nd century. That didn't settle the issue, though. People were still reading the Shepherd of Hermas, the Epistle of Barnabas, the Gospel according to the Hebrews, and all this. Some quoted them as scripture. So it was still wide open until 367 AD, when Bishop Athanasius, who was in the pocket of the Emperor Constantine, he sent out an Easter encyclical, a circular letter to all the churches and stuff, which said, okay, from now on, the New Testament is going to be these 27 books and no others. And that took a long time, because Eusebius is a contemporary of his. He has this amazing discussion about what's canonical and what isn't, and he says that there's one group that are just heretical forgeries, like the Gospel of Thomas, that nobody ought to read, and that most bishops wouldn't touch with a 10-foot pole. Then there are pseudonymous works that are fairly innocent, and some people put the Epistle of James in there, like Jerome thought that this is written by some admirer of James, but he didn't write it. But it's not bad. Then there were iffy ones, like the Gospel according to the Hebrews. Nothing really wrong with it. And there were the ones everybody agreed on, which is the 4 Gospels: Acts, 1 Peter, 1 John, and maybe James. And so he says even then there was a debate. It wasn't settled despite this circular letter. And our copies of the New Testament, the ancient manuscripts, still afterward have the Shepherd of Hermas, the Epistle of Barnabas, and all that. So it took a long time, but that appears to be the basic process by which it happened. And it was an attempt to exclude certain views and to encourage others. If it wasn't in there, it was because it was heresy. They claimed that they had the earliest apostolic books. Was it written by an apostle, or at least by the assistant of an apostle, like Mark and Luke? But of course there was no compelling reason to believe that those names actually wrote these, and there was no compelling reason to say that Judas Didymus Thomas had not written the Gospel of Thomas, but they didn't like what it said, so it had to be a forgery. So yeah, it was theologically, ideologically motivated completely. And but I wouldn't hasten to say that Gnosticism was the true understanding. It was one of several understandings, but this one won out.
So that's interesting. It makes me wonder. We have our canonical. You went back to, you said 126 AD approximately is when the supposed canon, the most earliest apostolic, the route to the canon is then. My question is, I guess the follow-up question to that is what are some of the earliest books that are written contemporaneous to these books, supposedly, that we have that pretty much compete with these books that are not in the canon? Are there a couple you can list that are very important in the process?
Well, the Gospel according to the Hebrews and what might have been other versions of it, namely the Gospel according to the Nazarenes and the Gospel according to the Ebionites, from what we hear about them, and there are several quotes and notes of difference, it makes it look like these were other versions of Matthew, that people were doing with Matthew what Matthew and Luke did with Mark. Well, from most of what we hear, there was nothing all that outrageous about them. But I don't know, they weren't widely enough known or what. There were interesting things in them, like, you know how the gospel writers after Mark are sensitive to this stuff about Jesus being baptized by John. Mm-hmm. What is he doing there? Well, in the gospel according to the Ebionites, I think it is, Mary and Jesus' brothers back home in Nazareth are like reading about John in the Galilee Gazette or something, and she says, "Behold, John the Baptizer baptizes unto repentance. Let's go." And Jesus says, "Why should I go? Have I committed some sin that I need to be forgiven for?" But he acquiesces anyway. Well, that you can see the trajectory going on there. Maybe they didn't like it, but I imagine they would have. And some other things. The Gospel according to the Hebrews had a version of the woman taken in adultery, though in its version it was a woman convicted of many sins, but it sure seems to be the same thing, basically. There was a second rich young ruler. This is really goody, where he says, "Well, what do the commandments say?" And he names some of them, and he says, "And yet it says to care for your brother, but you have many rich possessions, and not one of them goes out of your house to relieve the desperate plight of the poor." Boy, that's strong stuff. Didn't get in, who knows why. There might have been source documents like the Q document. That seems to have circulated in different versions. It was probably no longer copied at one point after Matthew and Luke had both used almost all of it. Of course, Mark was used by those two as well, but it was probably written in Rome, which gave it clout, and so people continued to write it.
Was Mark written prior to Marcion's coming on the scene? Well, I mean, like, what literature do you think when Marcion comes on the scene? He finds Galatians, and who's contemporaneous to him? But like, what's prior to him? Was Mark written, but not maybe Matthew, or a version of Luke and Mark were maybe written or floating around? And because it sounds to me, whoever rewrote Luke or adjusted Luke had to follow up with Acts. It's like they said, "Hey, let's not only are we going to fix this gospel, like you said, but we're going to add, we gotta add some stuff to this. We got to make sure that we have some more validity to this movement." And then they, of course, make Peter and Paul the same, practically on the same page. But which gospel do you think came before that?
Well, whatever, or Lucas, or whatever you want to call it, the which may have been the same as the Marcionite gospel, or that may have been a retooling of this or Lucas. I've heard both argued. there may have been a proto-Luke, which is like an alternative theory, that said that Luke, whoever he was, first combined Q and Mark. No, I think it was Q and L, the special material that only Luke has. And then somebody showed him the Gospel of Mark. He said, I got to go back to the drawing board. I got to put this in. And there are interesting arguments for that because of the way the L and the Q material are juxtaposed together, and then there's Markan material. It kind of looks like Mark was split up and inserted. Well, who knows? That might have been around. I think, though, all the Gospels are 2nd century, and that's about the time of Marcion, though there's debate about it. Hoffman gets into that they used to say that Marcion was operating early to mid 2nd century, but there are statements implying that he was active at the end of the 1st century. And so either way, though, I think Matthew and possibly Mark weren't written yet. Let's see. The Gospel of Thomas, some argue that that was earlier than at least some of the canonical Gospels. But that all hinges on whether you think the many sayings in Thomas that sound like other versions of sayings in Matthew and Luke are independent parallels, or if they represent Thomas using those Gospels, in which case that would put him some decades later. Mm-hmm. I believe Helmut Kester and John Dominic Crossan and Stephen Davies, I think, all say it's very early. And there are good arguments for that, but I think there are a couple of places where it's pretty clear Thomas has combined Matthew's and Luke's version of something, and the parallel statements are not verbatim the same. They're more or less the same. Now that could be because they varied in oral tradition, but my theory is that it was a special kind of oral tradition, namely that the compiler had heard people read from Matthew and Luke but didn't have his own copies. And so he worked from memory quotes like we do in discussion. We kind of unwittingly paraphrase it unless we go grab a Bible and look. If Barnabas was actually written by the character Barnabas from Acts, that would have to be pretty early, and almost nobody thinks it was, but I don't close that door. It seems to come from a different sort of a Christianity with a stance on Judaism. It's a bit different, but I'm not so sure. It's impossible. Some people think Revelation was the earliest New Testament writing. And this because, for instance, the depiction of the Messiah, the risen Christ, is very strange. He first appears to be like the angel Michael described in Daniel. And what is the subtitle of the book? The Revelation of Jesus Christ, who sent his angel to John. Well, this is the Son of God whose eyes are as flame of fire. He's the angel. And there's the angelomorphic Christology again. And then
what can you do with that? What do you do with that? It just is. Well, Derek, angel just means messenger, so the Son of God is the messenger. And I've heard this. So there's groups of people, I will leave unnamed, that literally believe everywhere you go in the biblical narrative, and of course we were taught the canon, when you see angel, think a man who's got a message for you.
Well, a lot of the time that would make sense.
Right, but I mean, cross the board. And I thought to myself, that's really weird. Satan is also a man to them. Turn to Peter. Satan? He tells Satan, Peter, get behind me. Or, you are of your father the devil, Satan. Okay, well that means they're a descendant of someone who's a man who's Satan. Okay, here we can go to the accuser again. Moses might be there, Satan.
Sheesh, wow.
Anyway, but this is the thing, and I know I'm rabbit trolling, but this is where it gets interesting. You get to Daniel, and you find Michael is wrestling with the Prince of Persia. Is this a guy down the street? Man, we wrestled for 20 days, and on the 21st, I got him.
Professional wrestling, the Sheik, and it's and the Prince of Persia, of course, is one of the sons of God. That mythology again, and there's. Michael is sometimes identified with Melchizedek in Jewish lore, and the name means who is like Elohim, and that might kind of mean this guy is Elohim, because nobody is like Elohim. Or the Messiah was the same as Michael in some Jewish writing. So who the heck knows, but then he is depicted as this goat with seven, or sheep, whatever, with 7 eyes and 7 horns. Great depiction of that in the movie Altered States. Oh, what a movie that is. And then later on, you have the myth of Zeus being born and saved from being devoured by a monster by Gaia. This is just Greek mythology, pure and simple. And Hades is thrown into the lake of fire. He's a guy. He's Zeus's brother. I mean, there's all kinds of weird stuff. Plus, this is swimming in astrology. Bruce J. Molina wrote this shocking book on the genre and message of Revelation. I hope Acharya read it, because it is the most amazing book on astrology in the Bible that can ever have been written. But what is going on? This is so different. Is it supposed to be some departure from any other I mean, there are plenty of apocalypses around, but even at that, this is very strange stuff, especially how Jesus is depicted in it. So some have said this is the earliest Jewish Christian document. Could be, who knows? So that would be a good candidate for a pre-canonical writing.